The great things about planning, and one of the things that I think makes good planners and good planning is knowing what all your tools are and what options you have. You know, we've learned in this conference about some of the things that we may not be as familiar with, like development agreements. Maybe we haven't used them in our communities. Maybe we don't have a program for transferring development rights. Maybe we hear about some of these things and they're a little scary to us because we hear some horror stories or we don't know very much about them. And so I think that this is a great opportunity for us today to hear from Wendy Fisher, who is one of the founding members of the Utah Open Lands Trust. A lands trust is a great tool and a resource to you in your counties when you have a particular type of project that warrants a special kind of understanding of conservation and the need to work with in a special way to hold maybe a conservation easement or do something that's a little unique to the traditional way of doing things. You may have a partner or a developer or somebody who wants to do something and it just doesn't seem to have the right ability to put the whole program together. And so Wendy's here today to talk to us about what are some of those other resources and those other tools that are good options for you in your community. I became acquainted with Wendy and her work several years ago through the Quality Growth Commission. I sat on the Governor's Quality Growth Commission, and Wendy would always be having projects coming for funding for conservation easements or different things. And just recently, in fact, the last one we funded in part was the Toll Canyon project just out of Summit. As you're coming off of the top of the hill and going back down into Jeremy Ranch area, if you look across the street, that canyon that runs to the south right there. Because of Utah Open Lands coordinating a bunch of efforts able to preserve and conserve a lot of that property there. And she'll talk about some of the projects they've done and how it works. So Wendy, since 1990 is when Utah Open Lands began 22 years ago. She's been with them ever since. She's the executive director of Utah Open Lands Trust, and it's a great tool that we have to understand better what land trusts can do for us. And so with that, we'll welcome Wendy and thank her for coming today and sharing with us.
Well, I am putting on the mic so that other folks can hear. How many of you have ever worked with a conservation easement? Okay. How many of you utilize conservation easements as part of the tool that you might utilize in creating a development agreement with a developer? Any of you done that? Okay. Well, those are some of the things that I would like to talk about today as I go through my presentation, and I thought this might happen. There's actually a great picture. So some of the pictures that I have in my presentation, I'm just going to have to paint for you because they're not compatible. They don't seem to be coming up on this. This is actually, I know you can't see it, but it's a picture of a golf course. Right? Why would I talk about conservation and golf courses with respect to conservation easements? You all are involved in your county government. Do you know what the top 2 reasons people come to live, work, play Utah? Why do they come to Utah? Do you know what the top 2 reasons have been almost for the past 2 decades? I'm sorry? Skiing, recreational opportunity. Quality of life, and basically they cite those 2 things as recreational opportunity and scenic views. I want to say that when I started Utah Open Lands, I remember being referred to as a communist plot. I want to dispel those rumors. Actually, I want to make sure that people understand that Utah Open Lands and land conservation is not necessarily something that's against growth or development. I see it as a balance, and I think we can all cite places we've gone to where there hasn't been a balance maintained in terms of that quality of life. And so one of the things Utah Open Lands finds that we do often is that we work with communities developers, landowners, farmers, and ranchers to protect some of that balance. The reason that I had the slide up here of the golf course is how many people that live next to golf courses golf? About how many people do you think golf? Half of them, 50%? Actually, 80% from a nationwide study, 80% of the people that live next to golf courses do not golf. They are there, and they are paying lots of money to be there, in part because they have this perception that it's open space, that it's always going to be protected. And in fact, oftentimes, golf courses are not protected in perpetuity. So let's talk a little bit about the conservation easement as a tool. And let me say this, if you have questions during the presentation, please don't hesitate to raise your hand. I think it will be, especially after lunch, a little bit more engaging for all of us. Keep people awake, myself included. So conservation easements are under our state statute. The Enabling Act is 5718(1). And that basically under that statute, it talks about the fact that the landowner be made aware that there are different kinds of conservation easements. There's kind of a recreational open space easement, there's agricultural easements, there are historic easements. And of course there are what we kind of look at as the wildlife habitat easements as well. There's also the ability to rescind your decision 3 days after you've recorded it. I'll talk about that with respect to the tax consequences we get there. And then also that they should be seeking independent legal counsel. I bring these things up because these are the things that a land trust focuses on. But as you work with landowners in your community or developers that might come in, it might be important for you to understand that statute. So what exactly does a conservation easement do? Well, most of you probably know that a conservation easement is a legal binding agreement that is entered into between a qualifying conservation organization, and that does include counties and state government, not just land trusts that are 501c3 organizations. And by that I mean an organization that is a public tax-exempt charity. And when you think about property rights, which I'm sure you guys, especially in this conference, have thought about a lot, there are a bunch of things to consider in those property rights. We also talk about the bundle of sticks analogy, where you have everybody in Utah knows that water rights, for example, are something that's transferable from your piece of property. Those water rights don't always necessarily stay on a piece of property, and of course there's the beneficial use law as part of that. Similarly, in Utah, many people realize that they don't actually own the mineral estate that is underneath the surface estate on their property. What a conservation easement does is it basically comes in and restricts some of the sticks within that bundle. So it will basically, I like to think of it as tying a ribbon around the development and and in some instances the timber rights, in some instances the mineral rights. And it basically ties a little bow around that, puts it in the agreement, and that land cannot be developed into the future. This, for example, is a piece of property that we worked on in Grand County. It's about 3,000 acres. It's along the Colorado River, and it actually includes a portion of Cisco Landing, which is where a lot of boaters end up if they do the Westwater Canyon portion of the Colorado River. And again, if you think about the fact that tourism is a clean industry, tourism is something that obviously attracts a lot of people here, and then you also think about the values within your community, there may be areas that are more appropriate to develop, and there may be areas that are important to conserve. In this particular instance, we were not working necessarily with the community or the county in terms of this. This was something that a landowner had wanted to do to protect their farm and ranch. And I think that one of the things that I think is very important is we talk a lot about private property rights here in the state of Utah. And certainly the private property right to preserve your land is something that we should be paying attention to just as much as we pay attention to the private property right to develop your land. So what is a conservation contribution or a conservation easement contribution, and how does it qualify, and why might you care? Well, first of all, one of the things that's interesting, and it happened in the project that Reed talked about, that we worked on with Toll Canyon, and that is that there are actually tax incentives. In fact, Senator Hatch right now is working with Senator Baucus on some conservation easement tax incentives. Because this is a way to accomplish conservation where you have a willing seller, so to speak, a willing donor, and you also are not having to pay for all of those values. And so in the Toll Canyon project, for example, we didn't get a full donation of the value, but we got a partial donation of the value, which helped immensely in reducing the amount of money that we needed to raise. And so you can use some of these tax incentives to actually enhance both the landowner's contribution, leveraging monies that you might be putting towards something like that, or in some instances, and this is something you need to pay a lot of attention to, and I'll talk about it in more detail. In some instances, you may be able to work with a developer where they have a lot of development rights and they decide that their project would be better off if they were actually able to donate those development rights instead of developing fully what they have vested on the ground. But we need to talk about the importance of following the due diligence on that. First of all, a qualifying conservation contribution under 170H of the tax code the conservation easement has to meet one of the following purposes. It either has to be scenic, have historic value, and that's not necessarily buildings, a clearly delineated government policy. And that's really where we get our agricultural preservation here in the state. We have the Farmland Assessment Act, we have a number of other acts pertaining to the importance of self-sufficiency and self-reliance and the protection of our agricultural lands. So the governor's executive order, for example. The ecological value or the wildlife, wetlands, that sort of thing. Public recreation or education. One of the things that has occurred in the preservation of Toll Canyon is that we're actually going to be connecting some community trails through that piece of property. And I think this is an important thing to think about as well. Certainly when we work with various different landowners and developers, there can also be a concern that maybe they don't want public recreation on their property. And so public access and public recreation are not a necessary thing for a conservation easement. But we think it's important to think into the future, and if there are trail connections that are vital to the overall quality of life you have in a particular community, you might want to consider that as you are going through and drafting conservation easements. And the job of the land trust is to enforce the restrictions that protect the conservation values. So you also, as a county, might put yourself in that land trust position of actually holding the easement. And then you, and especially when you're talking about a tax deduction that's taking place, it is incumbent upon you as that entity to enforce those restrictions. And there can be penalties and legal issues if you don't enforce those restrictions. Some of you may be familiar with the High-Heat Ranch. In this particular instance, the conservation easement included the protection of the historic barn facade. But again, I think, the thing that was interesting to me is as we moved forward on the protection of that property, it was really the landowner's initiation. They wanted to see it protected. As we worked with the county and the community, one of the things that was just, I think, really critical and an important part to the conservation process that we try to work through is that the community wanted to have the safe passage for a lot of the kids that were traveling to the middle school that is just beyond this particular piece of property. A lot of them were coming from some of the affordable housing that had been developed in some of the other areas that are right there. And so as part of the conservation easement, we allowed for a trail set off from the roadway, but something that kids would use because it was a pretty direct route to the school, which was important. And we've got that trail and several other trails that are connecting with other community trails, but the landowner still owns this property and they still pay taxes on the property as well. And I want to talk about that for just a minute as I talk about conservation easement and the contract that you end up with or the gift that gets made. I think that one of the things that I've heard often that can sometimes be a concern is if we're protecting these lands, are we limiting our economic development in the future? And I think it's a fair question, and I think it's a good question, and I think it varies from community to community. But I can tell you what we found statistically. Statistically, we know that nationwide, on average, for every dollar that you as a community get in residential revenue, it costs you between $1.35 and $1.65 in terms of costs. Why? What do you have to do when you get residential development? How come it's not just a net benefit to the community?
Roads.
Infrastructure, roads, the police, the services that you're providing. Conversely, for every dollar in open space revenue, and so I'm talking about greenbelt that a lot of these properties are under, it actually only costs the community about 65 cents. So there is a net revenue, and it goes directly to that issue. I like to say, cows don't go to school, the cops aren't being called out on the trout. So there are those sorts of things that are important to understand, but in addition to that, one of the things that has, and that study actually is something that has been done over and over again. Utah State University did that in conjunction with the Department of Ag. There are kind of economic studies like that throughout the nation, and I can send you some of that information if that would be helpful. But I think one of the other things that we're starting to recognize as well, and I'll be honest, I think it's a double-edged sword, but that is that land adjacent to open space has a higher market value. In fact, one of the first projects that we did, we worked with a developer who wanted to do a 9-lot subdivision. There was an important kind of entry corridor piece that also had some habitat on it, and it also could potentially provide for a trail connection for the community. We convinced the developer, and I will say it wasn't easy, to get him to take 2 of the largest lots, so part of the largest portion of the property, and put that into conservation. And by his own admission, the remaining lots that were adjacent to that open space sold for $50,000 more per lot than the other lots that were in the subdivision. We're finding that on average, open space will increase the fair market value of a piece of property adjacent to it, a lot, like a home lot, by about $5,000. So what that means is, again, when you start looking at economic development and revenue, again, looking at that balance, you can start to see that actually the open space that's preserved in a community that's contributing to your quality of life also actually may increase some values in the community and in turn increase that net revenue that is important as we're looking at economic development. So with respect to a conservation easement and the contribution that's made, oftentimes a contribution that is made, if it's made to a private nonprofit organization like Utah Open Lands, it also becomes a charitable trust or a public trust. And I think that that is important, and that's one of the things that Utah Open Lands has to enforce. There is no doubt that as we continue to grow and as we continue to develop, these open spaces will be in danger of being loved to death because everybody's going to go there, and we're seeing that. We're seeing when we protect a new piece of open space on the Wasatch Front, for example, you wouldn't believe the amount of use that we're getting from the public. And also, it's going to create some issues with respect to infrastructure. And there are ways to deal with that, and I think that it's important to understand that. I will say conservation easements are not safe from condemnation. That's both a concern and I think also a little bit of a safety in that if you have a planned infrastructure, a road that really needs to go in an area right by that conservation easement, it is something that you as a county can condemn that conservation easement. Obviously the concern is, and we've seen this, where potentially instead of doing correct planning and the right planning, it seems like the easiest option is to just go through that open space. So, we don't take condemnation lightly. We think there's definitely a need for it, but we've also seen some really bad projects that people have tried to put forward, and that doesn't make sense either. One of the other things that I wanted to mention quickly here was if you're working with a developer and they have vested rights and they want to donate a portion of that value and receive a tax deduction, it is possible that they can do it, but you also have to look at the quid pro quo issues that might come up. And this is something that, as we've worked with counties and we've worked with others from a planning perspective, that can be kind of hard to decipher. But here's the bottom line. So a developer comes in and he says, I want to develop 10 homes, but I think your code would allow me to develop 20. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and set aside 20 acres and 10 home sites that I'm not going to develop, and I'm only going to develop the 10. But he hasn't gone through the approval process, and maybe your county code requires him to provide some incentives in order to get the increased density of 20 homes. You might be, at that particular instance, edging into a quid pro quo situation, and I can guarantee you that quid pro quo issues, in other words, did he get something for his approval? Even if he was putting open space in, was he getting an increased value? Were 10 homes all he could ever develop anyway? And yes, he's clustering them. That still doesn't necessarily mean that he can get that tax deduction. Quid pro quo issues are something that the IRS will look at, and they do, and they have. So that's something that you need to be careful of and you need to look at. And that's also one of the reasons I think that sometimes counties like to work with a land trust. Because I think that you guys get put in a really tough position. You are, looking at the broad health, welfare, and safety of your community. You're trying to make sure that you're creating this balance and all of those different things. And then you're also having to judge a number of inputs that are coming through in terms of some of these development plans. Sometimes we've worked with counties where essentially they say, if you want to do the open space, you're going to have to work with Utah Open Lands or a land trust organization. And then that takes a little bit of the burden and the pressure off of you, because I don't have any authority on your planning and zoning. But I do know how the conservation easement works, and I do know what is going to kind of pass muster with the IRS, and also what's going to work from a conservation easement perspective. So oftentimes we've partnered in that way to enable the open space that maybe is required as part of the development or ends up coming from part of the development, and maybe creates a good partnership, take a little bit of the heat off of the community. This is a piece of property that we protected down in Grand County. It actually was a piece of property owned by SITLA. And in this particular instance, just to give you an example of one of the things that Utah Open Lands will do, we actually raised the money and purchased this outright. So the full fair market value of this particular property went into the permanent school fund for the children in the state of Utah under SITLA. And this land is protected. It is now a campground that is free to people who want to go climbing Castleton or want to stay down in that particular area. And it was an amazing fundraising campaign and demonstrated to me how so many people throughout the world love Utah and love its landscapes, because we got donations as far away as Switzerland and Japan from people who had heard about this particular place. Just very quickly, what are some of the tax incentives? And a lot of times these really accrue to the farmer and rancher. So we oftentimes like, not that we don't like working with developers, but we prefer to work with the farmer and rancher. We'd love to see those lands stay in family hands. I was just down on a piece of property. It's a 5th generation ranch. We're losing those, and I think it's sad. I think it helps maintain not just quality of life, but obviously a way of life and a heritage into the future, not to mention food. That's always good. Income tax, yes, there are income tax incentives. There's one that is moving through Congress right now that would make the current tax incentive, which is 50% of your adjusted gross income against the value of the gift. It would make it permanent. Right now it's been sunsetting every year. The estate tax is also another valuable part of the conservation easement gift or donation. And that especially works for farmers and ranchers. Oftentimes when they go to pass the land on to the next generation, they find themselves in a position where essentially the estate taxes, because that real estate value is so high, prohibits them from passing along to the family because they have to sell the family ranch in order to pay the estate taxes. Under Taxpayer Relief Act, I think it was back in 1997, called the Farm and Ranch Protection Act, they added to the incentives, especially for farms and ranches, so that if you have a conservation easement on your property, not only does it necessarily lower the value because it has stripped away some of the development rights, as we talked about, that bundle of sticks, but in addition to that, there's an additional 40% on top of that that you get to take as a deduction if you're passing that on to the next generation and it has a conservation easement on that. And that's under another part of the code, and I can give you all the citations if you want that. But the estate tax, I think, is an important value. Greenbelt, one of the things that we have talked with various different counties about, and there was actually legislation that passed called the Conservation Easement Rollback Relief Act here in Utah back in the early 90s. Essentially, there is no change to the property, even though you put a conservation easement on it, you're not going to be developing it. And so rollback taxes are usually not assessed for a piece of property where the conservation easement has been donated, and you have that protected in perpetuity. And again, as we've seen, it doesn't really necessarily hurt the economic viability. But again, with a private landowner holding that land in a conservation easement, that land does remain on the tax rolls. And I will also say that I pay my fair share as an organization of county taxes because the land that we hold in fee, we are not exempt from paying property taxes. So we pay those as well. We think it's well worth it because, again, it contributes to the quality of life and long-term viability as a community. So, you know, I think that is something that counties oftentimes are concerned about with respect to revenue. And I think it's something you should watch. Certainly, you want to have that balance. I like to bring this slide up. We worked with actor-director Robert Redford and his family to preserve some land along the Alpine Scenic Loop. But it's not, I don't bring this one up because he's so famous or anything like that. I bring it up because he was very different. I wish I had a picture of his property. Then this farmer named Gene Whedon. And that was, we actually worked on both of those projects in the same year. Two very different individuals, politically, ideologically probably very different. They had different reasons for protecting their land. Gene had worked through the Depression, and he wanted to see that viability of his produce that he grew and the farmland could continue on. Robert Redford was interested in the wildlife habitat and the scenic vistas off of the Alpine Loop. The one thing that they had in common was that they loved their land. And we see that so often with landowners and landowner families. Oftentimes you can't replace that gift of land that you have. There's a picture of his property. And today, Gene passed away actually in 1998. But today, the property, oh, shoot, this beautiful picture of veggies. So imagine peppers and tomatoes and green beans and some lettuce, and you all know what that looks like. There are two community-supported agricultural endeavors on his property that are going great guns today. And I have to say, I am often known as the worst-case scenario gal around the office, because that's kind of like coming and presenting to groups like this, where we're, you know, trying to make sure we don't get into lawsuits and things like that. The thing about the Whedon property and also conservation easements that I've witnessed over many, many years is there are always going to be challenges and there are always problems, but I never could have imagined the amazing contribution that his land makes to his community. I mean, just amazing to see how people just embrace that, they stop by the community gardens. They've had school programs out there, part of the school lunch program, giving food that they have that's grown fresh right there locally. I mean, it's just a neat thing to see and one of the best case scenarios. So I'm just going to go over this quickly from a conservation easement perspective. especially if you're donating a conservation easement, it's required that any gift over $5,000 requires a qualified appraisal, and actually in 2006, there were some changes to that appraisal requirement. And again, this gets down to the quid pro quo and some of the issues you might be facing. If you're working with a developer who, again, wants to contribute to the quality of life, he's going to do his development project, he wants to make it this great thing in the community, you can't use the subdivision analysis, which previously, when people had put a conservation easement on, they've been able to use the subdivision analysis as their primary analysis in the appraisal. That is no longer permissible. You have to use comparable sales as your primary analysis. And in some instances, you can back that up, or you can kind of substantiate some of your values by then incorporating a subdivision analysis. But if it doesn't follow those requirements, I can guarantee you that any donations that is there will be thrown out. Basically, just in very simple terms, the conservation easement, you take the fair market value of the property with no restrictions, or just the current planning and zoning restrictions, and then the value of the land once the easement has stripped away some of the development. And it's that difference that equates to the value that you place on the conservation easement, again, through that appraisal process. So again, highest and best use used to be comparable sales. You need to make sure, in addition, that if the landowner owns property adjacent to it, that you're taking into account how that open space benefits it. Again, coming back to what we're finding on a national level, that open space actually increases the value of adjacent properties. That's actually now been incorporated into the tax code, because they're seeing that too. And so your appraisal has to necessarily consider, if the landowner owns adjacent property and they're putting their land on a conservation easement, they don't get credit for the value enhancement that takes place on the adjacent land. There's some other things there. I don't think I'll, go through. Another picture you can't see, but imagine a ranch. This was a project that we worked on at 3,000 acres, and yes, the dreaded sage grouse. Bom, bom, bom. See, I had some music going with it too, but I don't know. Wow. What do you do, right? We're trying to create a situation, and this is one of the things that I think is important, and one of the reasons I am not a communist bloc. I think that if we can engage with landowners and work community by community, county by county, there's some landowners that they want to keep the land in the hands of the family, and they want to keep doing some ranching, and believe it or not, some of their ranching practices may actually be enhancing habitat for the sage grouse. Wow, if we can do that and we can show some efforts in protecting it, it would keep it from being listed as a species, which then creates obviously a whole other layer that we have to work through in terms of the development process. And that's something that we did here. We actually protected a 3,000 acre ranch. The landowner wanted to do it for the family, to keep the lands in the hands of the family. We purchased a portion of the value of the conservation easement, and then there was also a donation that was made. But this is actually a sage grouse lek, and it's thriving, and now it's permanently protected, and that's something that we can show as to the good faith efforts that I think people can make towards enhancement of this. So again, it's a tool that you can utilize in so many different ways as we face a lot of the challenges that come forward. And again, it's a really pretty property. I wish that my picture had shown up. What are some other things that you need to look at with respect to conservation easements? You want to make sure that you have clear title to the property. And so you need to look at the mineral rights. Believe it or not, you can still mine for oil and gas on lands that have conservation easements on it. There are some restrictions that you have to put in place, but because of some of the technology that is there and available for drilling, the IRS even recognizes that oil and gas rights can continue on under a conservation easement. But you need to look at it. Certainly strip mining, coal bed methane, things like that aren't going to work with a conservation easement. Why? Because the mineral estate is superior to the surface estate. And if that mineral interest underneath is so valuable, they can come in, pay the value of the surface estate. But in that instance, they would be destroying the conservation values that are there because, yeah, they're strip mining, and hopefully that makes sense. Other encumbrances, and this is also something to look at, especially when you're working with developers. Do they have a mortgage on the property? Because if you can't subordinate that mortgage to the conservation easement, and some banks are willing to do that because, again, they see the enhanced value that's going to happen through the development with the easement next door. But you have to make sure it's subordinate to the conservation easement, or else it won't qualify under the tax regulations. And then the donation does not, when you look at the donation, you are not necessarily verifying the valuation of that. Here's another piece of property that we protected along the Wasatch Front. It's kind of a trailhead access to this particular area. When you're considering what to put into a conservation easement document, one of the things that's very important is to look at the purpose. Does anybody know how long conservation easements are supposed to be on the property? Forever. That is a long time. And so we know that there are going to be changes, and we know, for example, at one point, we had put in a document, organic farming. Can guarantee you we did not mean organic farming the way people talk about organic farming today. We were actually talking about it not becoming a big kind of factory farm sort of thing. We wanted to keep it the natural kind of crop rotation that was existing on the property. And at the time that we did the easement, there really wasn't a certified organic program here in the state of Utah. But somebody's got to translate that as the years go by. So one of the things that everybody around the nation agrees on is that you really have to look at your purpose. Don't just throw in a bunch of things. But even talk about whether there's a primary purpose for this. Maybe the conservation easement includes wildlife habitat and recreation access and farming. Maybe all of those values exist. Is the farming value something that is more important in your particular community and for this particular conservation easement than the other two values? Put it in the purpose. So get down to drafting those kind of tight documents because it will help 50 years from now when people are trying to interpret what can be done on the property and how it is best enforced and used. The enforcement to protect the conservation values, you've got to look through the permitted and restricted uses which fall out of the purpose. So the continuing ranching use, usually you're taking out subdivision and construction. Usually there's a specific part for public access in specific areas. And you have to look at whether or not some of your permitted uses will impair the conservation values, because if they do, you could run into problems there too. There is the ability to amend conservation easements. And so every easement should have a limitation on those amendments, and that it has to be for the benefit of the conservation values, because even if there isn't a tax deduction taken, if down the road you amend the conservation easement and you allow development, everybody's going to be in a world of hurt because you're essentially taking the public trust and you're privately benefiting someone. The other thing that I wanted to talk about with people too is that a conservation easement might not be appropriate for every piece of open space that you want to protect in your particular community. And so you can look at deed restrictions. One of the things that you have to look at is typically a deed restriction has to be done at the time that you're transferring, getting into that development agreement, that sort of thing. So it kind of puts things into a pressure cooker situation sometimes. It is possibly terminable. In other words, you can terminate that agreement, and in some instances, you might choose that that might be a good thing, that you could do that in the future. You need to make sure that you're not misleading the public or those that come to the planning and commission meetings and letting them think that you're protecting it in perpetuity, if indeed in the future that deed restriction will allow for termination. The other thing is, oftentimes when we work with counties and cities, communities, and they put some funding into it. For example, if you get Leroy McAllister funding, please do not use a deed restriction. In fact, I don't think Leroy McAllister would let you do that, because deed restrictions, typically the right of reverter and things like that would exist in a deed restriction could actually force you to lose any investment that you made in terms of funding that you put towards it. So think about those sorts of things. the purposes and the permitted uses are negotiated with the grantor, and that is usually a private entity. Usually land trust organizations don't get engaged in these sorts of deed restrictions. And so the third thing that you, or the other thing you have to look at is that there isn't necessarily someone watching over what's taking place on this particular piece of property. And so after you've kind of chosen a mechanism that you want to utilize in order to preserve the land, one of the things that I think is very important for all of us to think through as communities, the landowner and the county, is stewardship. And I try to make it clear that a conservation easement is, and no matter how hard the fundraising is, no matter how long the campaign and the grants and everything that we did to raise the money to protect the property, it is really just the beginning of a process. And it's really just the first step. And so, for example, if you have trails or some sort of passive recreation that's on the property, it may not require a lot of maintenance, but I need to be clear that typically land trust organizations don't do that maintenance. So that's something to consider. Oftentimes we work with landowners, developers, and the community to ensure that there's funding there ongoing to ensure that maintenance. Because I think one of the things we've found in a lot of communities is that, especially when you don't have a private landowner farming and ranching that property, open space does take some maintenance, and it does take some work. Everything from weed control to, again, trails and recreation. Also, there's the issue of the enforcement of violations. Now, here's an area where I think having a partner like a land trust is a great thing for a community, and that's what we do. We enforce these things, and if need be, we take them to court. But it doesn't continue to put you all in the hot seat of protecting this open space as time goes on. There are obviously general property maintenance issues. One of the things that we've done is, again, working with the homeowners association that ends up getting created. Recently, and I know that legislatively you guys can't do this, but we actually asked for the developer to work on a voluntary amount of money that would go for some of the maintenance on the property. And so everybody signed up for that because he felt that that was a good thing to move forward in kind of the open space that was promised in the development. And people seem to be very happy with it. Again, you have a potential primary owner of being the county or a homeowners association or a private landowner. And I would include Utah Lands kind of in the private landowners, kind of be owned and fee. And one of the other things that we do, it's not a requirement, but we are required. Under 170H in the IRS law, it says we have to have the resources and the commitment in order to fulfill our obligation to protect these in perpetuity. And as we just discussed, that's a long time. So we do ask for a contribution. So again, if you've gone through a development process, even if there isn't a tax deduction being taken, that doesn't matter. In order for us to maintain our 501c3 status, we're going to go back to the developer and we're going to say we would like you to make a contribution to the stewardship of this property. And it's something really, we're actually finding the IRS is focusing in on this with public charities to make sure that they have the resources and the commitment to preserve the land. I have about 10 minutes left. We should go back to the pretty slide. If you have questions, that's pretty much the end of my presentation. Yeah.
You said that one of the drawbacks of the county holding the open space easement is that we would have to enforce the restrictions of the development. If that wasn't done, who would be coming back on the county to enforce this?
That is a good question. So I'm just going to reiterate that question for all of you. That basically, if the county takes on the obligation of the conservation easement and they don't enforce the restrictions within that conservation easement, who has potentially standing, and how could the county potentially get in trouble? Well, first and foremost, if it was a tax-deductible conservation easement that the county is holding, the IRS would have some issues with that because there's a public benefit that is not being watched over, and of course the person received a contribution, they received tax deduction And so that is something that's being taken seriously. We've seen in other states that adjacent neighbors have been granted standing in cases where conservation easements have not been enforced, either by a land trust or a county or city entity. So there's the potential that that is there. And also the Attorney General in some states actually is almost in a position where, again, what they're looking at is the enforcement of the public trust and the public benefit of this conservation easement. And so they, in some states, the Attorney General's offices have found it necessary, and it is part of their duty to go in and enforce the terms of conservation easement. Would anybody ever know that you hadn't enforced it? That's another question. I mean, you know, I think that's one of the things that sometimes happens is, you know, you got other things going on. You may not even realize necessarily that there's a violation on the property. Yeah.
Wendy, would you address transferring development rights and whether a trust actually holds development rights that can sell in places that have or even don't currently have programs, that you could hold those for the future and bank those, set values on those, and use transferring of development rights as part of the conservation process?
Yeah, with the transfer of development rights program, I think that you may be aware that they take on many different shapes and forms. So I will give you the example of the ones that I think work the best. Typically in a transfer of development rights scenario, what you do is you have hopefully an existing zoning that is fairly low, and you identify through your community planning process a sending and a receiving area. The receiving area is where you're going to increase the density. The sending area is where you're going to take that density, preserve the land, and shift it to the receiving area. Oftentimes, what you'll do is come up with some sort of equation that for every acre or 20 acres or whatever in the sending zone that you tie up, it equates to 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 10 more development rights. You come up with that kind of equation. Typically, a land trust is not the best entity in my mind to be holding those development rights and transferring them. And part of that is because there are a lot of moving parts, I will say, in reaching the development agreement with the developer on the receiving area, and making sure that you transferred the different values and you've got your own ratio that you are going to use. What typically happens is, in order to shift those development rights and give them to this new property, and also to ensure that everybody has the same playing field, right? We're being fair, we're not being arbitrary and capricious. At the same time that you send those development rights to be utilized to increase the density on this particular piece of property, you simultaneously will put a conservation easement extinguishing the development rights on the sending zone. Did that get to it, Benna? Any other questions? Yeah.
Another question on enforcement. What responsibility does the county have if a third party, like Utah Upland Land, holds the conservation easement, and let's say there's a building envelope that's required that it's a farming agriculture one, they have to maintain. Someone comes in for CUP for building. Is the county, are they required to let you know that this applicant is coming forward?
No.
So who, I understand, I was told it was a civil matter between the third party and the owner.
Yeah, so can I use that example and maybe expand on it? Because I think it's a really important thing. And again, what we hope to do is be a partner with the county and the community. But, these things, again, are going to live on for generations. So if you have, for example, a landowner that has placed a conservation easement on their property, but they have reserved some development rights within their property. Typical situation, landowner has 100 acres, wants the ability to have an additional house for the kids. first and foremost, we try to ensure in our conservation easements that by putting a conservation easement on your property and reserving a development right, that does not guarantee you any sort of zoning regulation approval. In fact, typically what we will put in is you can have that development right subject to all applicable local planning and zoning laws. So the onus really should first and foremost be on that person who owns the land when they're going for their development right. They know they have a conservation easement on it, something they should be informing the county of. But then also, you don't need to, as a county, say yes just because it's in the conservation easement. You know, hopefully it is allowed, and we try to look at that sort of situation as well. But then in terms of whether or not you go ahead and you approve it and we are made aware of it, let's say there was the right to develop the home, but it had to be in a specific location. And you as a county approved the ability to build the home, and you didn't specify anywhere. And as it turns out, the building envelope in the conservation easement that was defined, the house gets built over here. Technically, that's a violation of the conservation easement, and that is an issue between the holder of the conservation easement and the landowner. It would not necessarily, you guys are not responsible for having made sure that it complied with the conservation easement. Yeah. Go ahead. Yes, you.
Have you seen instances where the market value of the land in the easement has increased? I mean, it's brought that value up at all? I'm an appraiser, that's why I'm asking that.
Yes, and as an appraiser, I will tell you, it will be very interesting, I think, over the next several decades, because, as Will Rogers once said, land, they're not making any more of it. So, what we have seen is some of these farms and ranches that get protected, there is an instance I'm aware of, it's not a conservation easement we hold, but we have some enforcement rights on it. And the person ended up paying more for the land under a conservation easement than what the value of the land when it was originally appraised. And the reason was this person had looked all over the nation and hadn't found a piece of property that was as spectacular as this particular piece. So when you start getting to how much does a conservation easement actually diminish the value as an appraiser, and what is that difference between the fair market value and the encumbered value, I think over the next several years, that is going to be a tricky one, and I think it's something that the IRS will probably start watching as well. And it may actually change things in terms of the tax incentives that are available. I've only seen one instance of that. In most instances, there is a diminution of value even when the land transfers hands.
You're right, that's typical. And you have to look really hard to find that one or two instances where that happens.
Right, and finding comparable sales in general for
Yeah.
conservation easements is tough because not a lot of them have transferred.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes. Did you have another?
I just wanted you to talk about what resources or revenues you use to purchase easements. Where does the money come from if someone wants to sell conservation easement, doesn't want to donate the full value? What are some of the revenue resources that community might tap into?
We oftentimes work with private foundations, but I want to point out to you all that I think it's important for you to let your legislators know how important the Leroy McAllister Fund is for several reasons. Whether you believe necessarily in putting open space in your particular community, as a state, we are missing out on federal funding through the Natural Resources Conservation Service. Michigan, for example, gets $15 million to protect their farmland. They're a small state, but I think the most we've ever gotten is $3 million. That's money that can be leveraged by other sources. But if we don't have state money, and right now there's a very small, teeny amount in our only statewide open space fund. I'm consistently working with foundations to provide private funds, and they continually say, where are the public dollars? One of the reasons that we've been successful in leveraging money up in Summit County is not because Park City's there and it's affluent and all those sorts of things. It's because the public has actually passed bonds, and the private foundations look at that and say, okay, that's great, we know there's some public monies coming into this. So having a statewide open space fund, I think, could really provide some positive things, and all we need to do is fund it. We have that open space fund. But we need to let the legislators know that this is something that our residents and our landowners are looking for, and again, that we're missing out on some of those federal funds. So you have Forest Legacy, they require a match, they're a federal fund. You have private foundations, they usually require a match. You have the NRCS Farmland Protection Programs. They oftentimes, most of them, require a match. There are wetland reserve programs, there are grazing reserve programs, there are a number of different things out there, but typically they all require a match. And that's what I struggle with on a regular basis, is in terms of finding funding for that match. To give you an example, with Toll Canyon, I think that we only asked for $62,000 and we raised $250,000 from private sources. Huge match, a huge leverage, and something that I think is important to think about if we want to really protect some of our heritage and some of these vital lands that contribute to our quality of life.
More of a statement really, but you can comment on it. A lot of the state and the commissioners we deal with, and a lot of the public has a perception that we already have enough open space, that we have public land all over the place, this county. Some counties, down in our neck of the woods, 97% public land. It's hard for them to conceive that we need to protect additional land, or in their mind take land off the tax roll. And I think that the education is important to say there are critical lands that are in private ownership that need to be preserved, even though there's still a lot of public open space. Maybe not all that public open space needs to be preserved. We need to have that discussion in our county plans to say, these are areas that are really important for preservation, public or private, and these are areas that are not public or private to be conserved. And I think that's a discussion in our plans that we need to be having, and educating what a public land trust can do in terms of keeping property on the tax rolls and conserved, because there's always a perception that it will be taken off the tax roll.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we've seen is, and I need to wrap up because my time is short, but I guess the one thing that I would say is, I'm not going to get into the debate about, what federal lands, should remain protected, or if we have too many. Here's the fact. The majority of our summer calving grounds and fawning grounds are on federally protected lands or public land. The majority of their winter feed is on private land. The majority of our good productive farmland is still private, and it's the easiest land to develop because it's farmland. So we need to identify and strategize how we are going to sustain, as Reed said, some of these critical lands, and really kind of identify as a community, as a county, as a state, what are those lands that we want to protect, and how do we engage in the partnerships to do it? Because that's kind of outside of the realm that, yes, 85% is public lands, but it doesn't necessarily address some of the lands that we're actually growing food and eating from. So thank you very much.